there, this is Bryan Beller, and you are watching for BassPlayersOnly.com.
Hi everyone, John Leapin here. You're watching for BassPlayersOnly.com. We're coming to you from a secret, undisclosed location somewhere in southeast Michigan with our old friend, Mr. Bryan Beller. Hey, Bryan.
How are you? How are you? Good morning to you. We are in a secret hotel lobby. I will say that much. This explains the sunglasses, and we are in the middle of a tour right now, and sleep is sometimes good and sometimes something else. So, pardon me. I'm not trying to pull the rock star move here.
Well, you look marvelous. You look like a rock star, yes. Well, I was looking over the interviews that we did. Our first interview, you were one of the first interviews we did on for BassPlayersOnly.com. The first one was in 2009, I think. Wow. And, boy, great story how you chose the upright bass in school because it was the most obnoxious instrument you could find.
Yeah, I'd like to think I put those days behind me. It was a long time ago.
It was.
I can still be obnoxious every once in a while, but hopefully not as much as when I was 9 years old.
Well, we talked about the Zappa thing, and we talked about Mike Keneally and Steve Vai, Joe Satriani, and then the next one I think we did like 2013 or something like that, and one of the records had come out, and some interesting things about when the band hadn't really gelled at that time. You had played a few gigs, and then you did a record, and then you did a tour, and you were wishing that you had known each other musically to the extent that you did after the tour so you could do the record again. And I think now you've been playing with the guys long enough that you know each other, and you've got a brand new record. I want to ask you actually about two new records. One of them is the new Aristocrats record.
Yeah, and then You Know What? That's what it's called.
You Know What?
Yeah.
And the other is the new Bryan Beller solo record. So
right.
Which one do you want to talk about first?
Well, let's talk about the Aristocrats album first. You Know What is our fourth studio album. We took a little bit of a break. We had made 6 albums in 4 years, which is 3 studio and 3 live, and we were going pretty hard there for a while. So we decided to just take a little bit of a break, and then we came back super fresh, and we kept our formula the same. We each one of us writes 3 songs for the album, and that's Guthrie's 3 songs, and Marco's 3 songs, and my 3 songs, and then you get a 9-song album. And same aristocratic rules as always: do whatever you want, just have fun. And so there's a lot of different kind of genres and styles on the album. Everything from like a kind of a blues rock, and then there's like a kind of a flamenco Spanish fusion thing.
Eddie, what is it?
Spanish Eddie.
Spanish Eddie.
Yeah, the blues rock. I'm not sure that I can say the name of that song on this family-friendly channel. So.
Oh yes, the first track on the album.
First track, yes. But that's why we're called the Aristocrats. So there you go. And then there's like a kind of like a hyper Irish folk song, that's all bent out of shape. That's Marco's When We All Come Together.
Yeah.
And there's like a Beatles-ish kind of John Mayer pop instrumental thing called All Said and Done, which I wrote. Guthrie has a really heavy tune called Terrible Lizard. And there's a beautiful ballad that Guthrie wrote, actually, that has a crazy... It's very difficult, but it's very sensitive and beautiful, this chordal bass part that he wrote. And he played on the demo, so I have to figure out how to do it. But it's called Last Orders, and it's a real showpiece for the bass that Guthrie wrote. And it's funny because a lot of times, the showpiece for the instruments, are not written by the instrument of the songwriter. It's one of the nice things about knowing each other a lot better now is that, I'll write something where I'm like, oh, I know Guthrie will really have a blast with this, or I know Marco will totally destroy this. And Marco will do that for Guthrie, and Guthrie will do that for me, and we just we just pass the ball around. So it's been a lot of fun, and the album's been received really well, and we're number 2 on the Billboard Jazz charts in the first week that it came out. If it wasn't for Michael Bublé, we might have been number 1.
Well, that was quite a shock to you. I think one of your previous records was on the Billboard Jazz charts.
It is the jazz chart. It's jazz chart. Somehow we've been classified as jazz. Like, it's that weird thing. It's like, well, instrumental must be jazz. It's like, come on. But, hey, we don't care. It could put us on the Billboard country charts at number 2. That's fine, too. I don't care.
One of those songs I think would qualify.
That's right.
Yeah, that was a bit of a surprise when I listened to that. But, wow, it was great. I really admire the way that egos don't seem to get in the way, and you guys seem to genuinely like each other. And I always hear repeatedly, not just from you, but from the other guys also, about this democratic way, 3 for you, 3 for you, 3. So there doesn't seem to be a mo in the 3 of you, like hey, why I oughta.
Yeah. Well, I mean, listen, we're all human beings, and of course, sometimes we got to talk about stuff, but we all had solo albums out before we met, and we had all done clinics too.
Yeah.
And that's the underappreciated bit, I think, in some way, because when you're doing a clinic, you have to be on stage by yourself, kind of like leading the audience in the show, and you're doing a lot of talking, and you're just holding that space for a lot of people in a different way than just releasing an album. You release the album, you put it out there. Obviously, that's a skill. You got to write the demo. You got to be in charge of the recording and make sure it is what you want it to be. And then you release the album, and then it's out. But then there's go out and playing it live, and you got to kind of like hold the space on stage. So now with 3 people who have all gone through the recording process with their solo albums, and all who have held that space on stage, that's an interesting combination suddenly.
Yes.
You know, so all of us are capable of kind of like tossing that ball around as well, both on the songwriting side and the actual studio production side, because everybody produces their own track in the studio. You know, so we become each other's session musicians in a way, you know, for each other's songs. But of course, it all ends up sounding like the Aristocrats, because the sound of the Aristocrats is the 3 of us.
Yeah.
And that's the great thing, you know. So the combined energy of Marco and Guthrie and myself is really what makes the Aristocrats the Aristocrats. And after a while, you know, you can't really tell who wrote what song. I mean, if you know us really well, you can get little hints here and there. Think, oh, okay, I hear that a little bit. But not for the most part. For the most part, it's just like, wow, who wrote that one? Cool song. And that's what we want, you know.
So for those of us who are familiar with your work and your previous albums, I think we can spot some of your writing.
Well, you know, what's interesting is that the stuff that I'm written for this new solo album that I'm putting out right now, called Scenes from the Flood, which is a double progressive concept album. This is not like the stuff I used to put out.
Right.
You know, the stuff I used to, like my first 2 albums, View and Thanks in Advance, I think were kind of confused as to whether they wanted to be fusion, rock fusion, or progressive rock instrumental. And I finally kind of resolved that dilemma in my head. And I think part of it is because all the writing I'm doing for the Aristocrats is essentially rock fusion, right? So that you know, there's not a lot of room for just a full-on progressive arrangement, because you've only got 3 people. We got to pull off this stuff live. So I just kind of got off the fence and decided I really wanted to make a progressive album with a lot of layering, a lot of arranging, you know, big, thick, dense tracks, and make a story out of it, like my favorite albums were when I was growing up, like The Wall, you know. And that's like incredibly arrogant and audacious to say that I'm shooting at a target that high, but that's the way that I always felt like an album should feel, that had a concept and a story and repeating melodies that went through the album. It's like that's what makes it an album, or at least a concept album.
I love the production.
Oh, thank you.
And the flood, that is powerful.
Oh, the song The Flood.
Yes.
Yeah, you know, so you know, that's just me and Janet Fetter. And Janet Fetter is a guitarist from Denver. She plays prepared baritone guitar, which essentially means that she alters the strings. She puts little devices on the strings, like a split ring or like a roach clip or all sorts of weird horsehair, and makes the strings in the instrument resonate and vibrate in ways that a normally tuned guitar wouldn't behave. It just wouldn't do that.
Just imagine her tinkering all day long with different...
And it's because her album, This Close, from 2015, her most recent album, absolutely was one of the key inspirations for my album. And so I really wanted to have her artistry on one song, and it's very specific, it's very unique, and it's an ambient piece with there's melodic content to it, but there's no real rhythm. It's just an ambient piece with ebbs and flows and different acoustic sound designs that, you know, even if I could describe them to you, I wouldn't want them to. I wouldn't want to describe it, because it's just part of the mystery is like, well, how'd she make that sound? So I'm playing piano and keyboards, and she's on that track. But that's the ambient piece that closes the first half of the album.
Yeah. And the sound of the rainfall is really authentic. It really sounds incredible.
Thank you. You know, the person who mixed it is Forrester Saville, and I knew him because he mixed the Carnival album, Sound Awake. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with Carnival. Their bassist, John Stockman, it's one of the great recorded bass sounds of all time, one of the great rock bass sounds ever. It's this song, Simple Boy, and the song Goliath, the first 2 songs on their 2009 album, Sound Awake. And I heard that stuff, and I was just like, who are these guys? Yeah. Who's that bass player? And who mixed this? And so eventually I ended up in Australia when I was on tour with Joe Satriani and the Aristocrats, and I met John Stockman, and then I met the engineer. And I came up to him and I said, how would you like to work on a double concept album that'll take forever and be an incredible amount of work, but hopefully rewarding in the end? And he was like, I'm up for it.
You have been working on it for a long time.
Yeah. Been working on it for 3 years. That's how long it took to go from front to back.
The finished product sounds great. I've been listening to it, and I enjoy it very much.
Thank you. You know, and just because this is like a for bass players thing, an interesting thing is I mixed it for 9 months. I took 8 months to do the demos, and the whole thing was 3 years in and out. But recording the bass, and this is just a little bit about like maybe not to be too precious about when you do tracking, like I'm sitting there making the demos, and like I'm not a great guitarist, so it's taken me a while to kind of get the guitar parts out and all these keyboards and and programming all the drums so that the drummers kind of know what the vibe is supposed to be. And then it's time to play bass on the demos, and I would just grab the first available bass that I thought sounded right for that song and just knock it out. And when I got all the demos done and I had this 18-song, 88-minute demo album, I thought to myself, okay, well, I gotta get this guitarist to do this part. I gotta get this drummer to do this part, and it was taking a long time to get all this stuff together, of course, because it's 18 songs. And then, like, I kept thinking to myself, yeah, I'm gonna go back and replace the bass. I didn't replace any of it. None of it. It's all the demo bass, and half the album is recorded like straight into an M-Box 2 Mini, straight into Pro Tools. Wow. So first of all, it's a testament to Forrester Saville. He knows what he's doing. But second of all, it's also a bit of a, hey, the bass has a specific role, especially in a large arrangement. If there's a lot of layers, it doesn't need to take up like, a huge amount of space. It's not like the Aristocrats. You probably couldn't get away with that with the Aristocrats because it's just a trio. And so we used some nice compressors. We went in the studio, recorded 2 tube DIs, a solid state DI, and mic to cab, and did all that thing. But it's not necessary every time.
Yeah, you remind me. I interviewed Glenn Hughes a few years ago, and he was talking about when he did an album, and he was singing the scratch tracks during the demos when they were recording, and they got everything the way they liked the guitar, the drums, everything. And he says, "Okay, now I'm ready to sing the vocals." And the guy said, "What do you mean? You already did."
Yeah.
And they ended up using this scratch tracks, which sounded pretty darn good.
If you're making a demo and you're in Pro Tools or you're in some other digital audio workstation, it's not like an old 4-track recorder used to be. It's not even like an ADAT. You're in a system that is capable of making professional recordings pretty much at any time. And there's almost no replacement for the songwriters out there. The original inspiration that you have when you make the demo, that when you're actually executing the idea that you had and it goes right down, the first time that you hear it right, you're like, that's it. That can never be replaced. Right. It can never be duplicated.
The energy and everything.
Yes. It's like songwriting and performance actually go hand in hand there at that point. So pay. I had to learn that about halfway through the album. I'm like, wait a minute, I'm not just I realized I wasn't just making demos. I'm like, some of this stuff is going to get kept. I'd better start editing.
But it takes some of the apprehension out of it if you don't know, this is it, this is count, got to make a count. It's more relaxed, and like you say, it comes out better sometimes.
Yeah,
sometimes.
Sometimes you got to do stuff. But I mean, as far as the instruments that I used,
tell me about your gear.
Well, as some of your readers may know, most of my instruments were stolen in the end of 2016, so I had to kind of start over and rebuild my arsenal. I only had a couple left, and that was a really interesting and educational process because I learned a lot of things about instruments, about woods and certain pickups and preamps that I knew what I liked because I knew what I had, but I hadn't like gone all the way into why. So I learned those lessons and I went all the way into why. And I ended up with some really cool instruments as a result. For the Aristocrats album, I found another 1998-99 red Mike Lowe Modern 5 that sounded a lot like my old one. I got it a week before the album was recorded. It was a miracle. I found it used in Poughkeepsie, New York. And so that's on there. And then there's also a Spectre Forte, which is like I just have this vision now of like, Mike Lowell does these great vintage sounds, the Fender sounds, jazzes and Ps, like with the necks that are just absolutely the best in the world. They're my favorite instruments to play.
Feel great to play.
They feel amazing. They sound great. But the Spectre thing is a totally unique thing. That's like a more modern focused kind of thing. And those Spectres with the neck through, as opposed to a bolt-on, even though I don't like the way that neck throughs feel as much as I like the bolt-ons, they do sound more somehow unified. So that sound is not like, the vintage Mike Lowell is on D-Grade, X-Movie Jam, and it's on Terrible Lizard, and it's on Last Orders, that song where I had to play the chordal stuff. But then the Spectre, the more modern one, that's on Marco's, the Crazy Rave Irish thing, When We All Come Together. It's also on Spanish Eddie. It's like a little bit more of a fusion instrument, and it's got this really sweet kind of, that's what I'm looking for. Sweet mid-range with a little bit of crystal top end.
Is the Spectre a 5 also, or a
5? They're all 5s. Yeah, it's a Spectre Forte 5, and those two instruments pretty much got me through the through the Aristocrats album. Then on my solo album, I didn't even have that red mic, the old '98 Mike Lowell when I was recording that. So what I had was I had another 99 that I used just for a couple things, but what I really used a lot was my Alex Webster Spectre signature. The guy from Cannibal Corpse did a really great job designing an electronic set. He worked with EMG, and Spectre and EMG have had a partnership for a long time. The DC-40 pickups and the BQC preamp, the EMG inside a Spectre body with an alder body, a maple top, and an ebony fingerboard. Those are the specs. And I've had them in a bunch of different instruments since then. I even have a Mike Lowell that does that now.
I was going to ask you, what kind of pickups are on the Mike Lowell basis?
Well, the original ones, the old ones, it's the Seymour Duncan 6770 Jazz. So that's like a real vintage jazz type thing with a little bit of extra sparkle and grit in the mid-range and high mid-range. Yeah. But for the new Bryan Beller Modern Focus 5, basically I stole that electronic set and I put it into a Mike Lowell bolt-on configuration, with an alder body and a maple top and an ebony fingerboard, and now it plays the way that I want an instrument to play, and it sounds like that mid-range Modern Focus sound. It doesn't behave exactly like a Spectre, and it shouldn't. Spectre is Mike Lowell and Mike Lowell.
Right.
And everybody's been really, really great about this because everybody knew that my collection got wiped out. So it was one of those things where everybody was super cooperative, and now I have a couple of really, really great choices, I think, in order to be able to pull off a lot of different sounds. And so for the solo album, I used the Alex Webster for like the really big arrangements like The Storm and World Class, and then for the more straight ahead rock tune like Volunteer State, that's a straight ahead rock tune that has Joe Satriani on it. I used that PJ, like the dark alder rosewood, real kind of thick classic. That's PJ5, Mike Lowell. Same thing on Bunkistan. It sounds like a P bass, but it's really a PJ. And then I had this little secret weapon. I went out and I got this beater Ibanez SRX 535 Korean 5-string. And it had this kind of weird lo-fi nasty bite to it. The electronics in it were kind of a joke, but so what I did was I took it to Kerry Nordstrand, and I had him put his Music Man replacement electronic set in there, pickup and the preamp, inside this old Ibanez, and suddenly this thing was like punching way above its weight. And so there's a song called As Advertised, which has a really kind of a jangly pick attack, like jing, 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 and it sounded great for that. Also, there's a song called Always Worth It, where it's kind of a more subtle pick attack too.
Is that the one you're singing on?
No, that's Angles and Exits. That's a cover of one of Janet's songs. Janet Fetter's song wrote that. She wrote that. And the only real bass feature, it's not a bass album at all. It's got all these great guitarists. It's John Petrucci and Joe Satriani and Guthrie Govan and Mike Keneally and Mike Dawes. This incredible.
I see Teddy Kumpel's name on it.
Teddy Kumpel is on there.
Is he ever not happy?
He's so great. He plays a killer solo on Always Worth It. And Rick Masalem and Griff Peters and Jamie Kime from Zappa Play Zappa, Jake Howsam-Lowe from Plini's band, Janet Fetter, like I mentioned, Neely Brosh, who kills on World Class. It's just an amazing collection of people, and I'm grateful to have worked with them all. But the only song where the bass is really the lead is a song called Everything and Nothing. It's the one with the spoken word. And for that one, it's got this kind of like constant, almost David Gilmour-y double delay, that and I printed it live. It's not a Pro Tools delay, or it's not a post delay. I actually used a TC flashback, turned it on, and played into the digital audio workstation. And so that song has a lead bass wah with lots of delay on it and a slapped underneath kind of thing.
And what were you going for in the spoken word? To me, it sounded like, and I hope this doesn't come out wrong, kind of a cross between Frank Zappa and Rod Serling.
Yeah, you're not far off. I mean, like, what people have been saying is like, some people were like, yeah, it sounds like Joe's Garage, like the voiceover of the Central Scrutinizer, and other people were like, that's Vincent Price from Thriller, right? So it's neither one of those things actually. The real thing is it's supposed to be kind of like a voice of God, or at least some kind of spiritual being that's like setting up one of the central themes of the album. And so I don't want to spend too much time on this because this is not for bass players only, but the theme of the album is about ambition and loss, about kind of intentionality when it meets reality, right. And what happens when your best laid plans kind of like run into life, and then what do you make of it all? There's some disillusionment themes that I'm dealing with there, and not just like personal stuff, but at a society level.
Bass players think about that stuff too.
Do they? I don't know. And so Scenes from the Flood. I had this concept of like, you start off with this really kind of optimistic worldview, and you're trying to get a lot of stuff and achieve certain things and have certain things that you want in your life, and then some random event occurs which just comes out of nowhere and really, really alters the way that your life is going to go. And so who are you when you come into something like that? And who are you when you walk out of something like that? Usually you're not the same person. What is that process like? And what are you left with in the end, after you go through something like that? And I think that most people, after you reach a certain age, you have gone through at least one of those things, if not two or three.
Sure.
So that's what I was trying to tackle with this 88-minute, 18-song album. And there's bass playing on it too.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, yeah. Well, obviously you put a lot of time and thought and effort in it, and the end result is wonderful. I recommend it. Getting back to your gear, you play, is it D'Addario strings still?
Yeah, Pro Steels, 45, 65, 85, 105 with a 130 taper core B.
Okay. And Gallien-Kruger?
Yep, the Gallien-Kruger. I use the Fusion preamp, and it's the MB Fusion, the original one. I use it as a preamp, and then I slave that into two 2001s. So it's two big power amps, essentially. And then I put those into two 410s. And the 410s, it's all Gallien-Kruger. It could either be a CX 410, which I'm using on this tour, which is their entry-level 410, which I think sounds great. Or I'll use the RBHs, which are the super pro ones. But it's better to have roadies for the RBHs. Those are heavy cabinets, So for Satriani and Death Clock, I'll use the RBHs. For something like the Aristocrats, when we're in a van, the CXs work really well.
Okay. Probably too many effects to list here, right?
Well, I mean, I've been using the same effects for a long time. I mean, the Exotic Effects Bass BB preamp is my go-to overdrive, and I have the Dunlop Bass Wah, which I've been using forever, and it's one of the things that I go to for a solo voice. And whenever I use the bass wah, I always drive it. If you put bass clean into a wah, it just kind of goes wee wee, and if you put overdrive in front of it, then it barks. So I use the Exotic Effects Bass BB preamp and like a Digitech bass driver, the old red pedal. It's been around forever. Those two together with the wah, that makes a pretty cool sound. That's what you hear on like Sweaty Knockers, and it's what you hear on Everything and Nothing and a few other things. I mean, I have the brown box, the Boss OC2. Often imitated, never duplicated.
Right.
It's a great old pedal. My chorus right now is a classic Boss. It's a CE2B. And that sounds great. It's got the old Bucket Brigade chip in it, and it's really cool. I have a few other things. I have a dark glass vintage microtubes, and that I use for certain kinds of really nasty ching 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 sounds. Because I don't play with a pick, it makes my fingers sound like a pick. And I have a what's the delay? I use the regular Boss digital delay, even though the TC flashback is great also. Mm-hmm. And I have a TC Hall of Fame reverb. That's it.
Okay, because I know how important tone is to you and how much time and effort you put into it. And
I always go into a large sound room before any tour and bring everything and set it all up, because I feel like it's important to practice those things just as much as it is to practice a part. You should be I feel it's at least as important. I mean, listen to what do people remember about what they hear about music? The sound is the first thing. It's like if you hear Victor Wooten, you start hearing his thing, you're like, oh, that's Victor. It's not because Victor played a dominant thing and did a 16th and 8th note rhythm pattern. It's because you heard the sound, the totality of Victor Wooten. And same thing with Jocko, of course, right? You hear Jocko, it's Jocko. It's not that he's playing, oh my God, did you hear that lick he played over that B flat low green blah blah blah. It's not that. It's the sound of it. So it's at least as important.
When you play in a room by yourself and you get a killer sound, but it's just you, and then you go in and then there's drums and there's guitar, and how do you keep that from getting lost? And how do you retain that killer sound?
Play along the tracks. What I do is I go into a sound room, I'll go into a big room and I'll have a PA set up with monitors, and I will put tracks in the monitors and absolutely blast them. I mean, just as loud as you can take it. To simulate what it would be like on a loud stage and sound bouncing around all in the house and everything like that, and then play that bass sound that you just spent an hour working on and see if it's still there. If it's still there, you did it right. If for some reason it's completely gone, needs more work.
Gotcha.
And a lot of times that comes down to the quality of mid-range that you have in your tone.
I do want to ask you one question about technique, because more and more people, we're known for our interviews. We've got over 600 now, one-on-one bass player interviews. Now we also offer online bass instruction, and more of our audience is coming. I migrated everything over from johnliebman.com. We've got 150, 160 courses right now, and a lot of the people we're attracting seem to be men in their 50s and 60s. Now they're retired. They've always wanted to do this. They have some time, and we get some aspiring career people too. But I just wanted to ask you what you can share with somebody as far as what is the most important thing that you need to understand and be able to do as far as playing the bass, as far as technique goes, or anything that you can share.
Make sure that you sound good. I know it sounds like I'm being redundant from before.
Well, are you talking about tone? Are you talking about articulation? Are you talking about
yes,
groove, time?
Yes.
All of the above.
Yes. The thing is, just that all comes together when you strike one note. Technique. People, when you say technique, people maybe might think, oh, how many 16th notes can you play beats per minute and blah, blah, blah. But what technique really is what does your one note sound like? And all of your notes should sound like that one note. Now, if you want to be deliberately dynamic and play a little harder, play a little softer, make the string bark, that's fine. But that should all have a consistency and a formula to it as well in your playing. And so when you're playing along with a band and a drummer and a guitarist and whoever's in the band, the very first thing that they encounter is the sound of your one note. That's everything. So sure, practice your 8th notes, practice your 16th notes, play along with records, practice your extended technique if you really want to go there. It's not as important for a bass player, I don't think, as it is for maybe other instruments. But practice the sound of your note. Make sure that the tone of your note really sits well in a band. And if it doesn't, why doesn't it? Is it because that your right hand isn't striking the string in a, I don't want to say proper, but in a way that generates the sound that you want to get? Are you leaving too much space between your finger and the string? Or are you too close to the string? Is your hand in a weird angle? Are you playing it too far up the neck or too close to the bridge? All these things matter. That's where I start with technique when I start, sitting people down. I'm not Adam Nitty, I use Adam Nitty as an example as someone who has taken right-hand technique all the way to the end because he could do anything he wants, alternate any finger he wants as fast as he wants. It all sounds great. It all sounds smooth. It all sounds wonderful. I never did that. But you don't need to go that far in order to have the tools that you need to play most gigs and make sure that your sound is really good. So the thing that I offer when it comes to technique is technique around tone. And so, if you're going to play along with the Led Zeppelin record, what does that sound like? Those big fat notes that John Paul Jones is putting out there. Does your tone sound like that? Can you make that sound? If you can't, why not? Find out. If you want to sound like Jocko, if you want to do that, can your hand make that sound? Can you put your hand all the way back at the bridge pickup and roll the treble off and do all the things that you need to do, have the right instrument, and then have the technique in order to do that? If you can, good. If not, why not? Because there's science around it all. There's science around, everybody has a kind of a built-in thing, but there is science around the way that other people sound. Why does Flea sound like the way he does on the Mother's Milk album and the Blood Sugar Sex Magic album? There's some gear choices around there. Find that gear, get your technique together, and then match it. And then as you go through these processes and you do enough of these things, pretty soon the sound of you just kind of comes out. So do the work of emulating these other sounds. It's not, I think some people may be afraid to kind of go that far into emulating other sounds because they don't want to sound like somebody else. You'll never sound like somebody else. That's the whole point. Even if you're doing somebody else's thing, you'll sound like your version of that. Yeah. So do your own thing by getting that stuff together and absorbing the tonal knowledge of other players the same way that you would absorb the circle of fifths or, any other theory or technique related exercise.
I love how you are so into bass. Bryan, congratulations on the new records and the tour, and keep it up, and much luck and continued success to you and the guys, your solo career, Aristocrats, Satriani. You mentioned Death Clock. I didn't know you were still doing anything with
Death
it.
Clock is, hasn't done anything in a while, but, they may be getting back on board, so we'll just see how that goes.
All right. Hey, by the way, I did a great interview with Pete Griffin when he was out on the Generation Axe tour, which was wonderful. But anyway, we got to wrap it up here, and you've got to get on the road for your next stop. But thanks for taking a few minutes with us. Much appreciated. Keep doing what you're doing. If the Aristocrats are coming your way, do not miss them. Great show, great album, great bass sounds.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Thanks very much. On location from the secret, undisclosed, top secret location in
bunker in
Southeast Michigan.
Exactly. All right.
I'm John Liebman. You're watching the #1 site for exclusive one-on-one bass player interviews, and now more and more people's favorite site for learning bass online, for bassplayers.only.com. I'm John Liebman with Bryan Beller. Thanks for checking it out.